Cultural and media imperialism. In the first lecture on specific theories of global media studies, we will look at cultural and media imperialism, the concept that has contributed more strongly than any other to shape and influence the very field of international communications. Cultural imperialism is a term used in many fields, including history, postcolonial theory, anthropology, and it has been used in global media studies to look at and explain the power relations between different media markets and specific first world media industries vis-a-vis Hollywood versus third world media environments. I'd like to start this lecture with some definitions. I will then delve into some theories and I will present some of the major figures that have shaped discussions of cultural imperialism. To conclude, I will explore some critiques against cultural and media imperialism and will open up some questions. The term was first coined by Herbert Schiller in 1976 in his book Communication and Cultural Domination. Schiller is somehow considered the father of cultural imperialism and certainly its most famous critic, and we will discuss his work in the next few slides. To continue with definitions, though, the concept of cultural imperialism is often used to refer to the idea of America exerting cultural influence over the rest of the world, with a particularly powerful imposition on third world countries. While imperialism is a general term that refers to any country or government exerting its power over a perceived weaker culture, the cultural imperialist thesis has traditionally associated cultural domination with American culture specifically, and media imperialism with Hollywood. Cultural imperialism has also been defined as the use of political and economic power to exalt and spread the values and habits of a foreign culture at the expense of a native culture, which explains why this argument has been consistently utilized to support ideological critiques in international communications. Finally, our last definition refers to the cultural imperialist thesis, which claims that authentic, traditional, and local culture in many parts of the world is being battered out of existence by the indiscriminate dumping of large quantities of slick commercial and media products, mainly from the United States. Now, as you can tell, the terminology that often accompanies cultural and media imperialism is in no way subtle. Instead, it attacks the Western cultural system directly and advocates for the preservation of local and native identities. As influential as it's been, the idea of cultural imperialism was not born in a vacuum, but developed out of major schools of thought within the history of critical theory. The first influence can be attributed to Marxism, a method of socio-economic analysis originating from the mid to late 19th century works of German philosophers Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. While originally not referring directly to media and communications, Marxism has become a staple theory to explain the ideological effects of media on their audience. Marxism sees culture and communication as the ideological superstructure of the world's capitalist economy's expansion. In this relationship of cultural imperialism, the role of culture is both economic and ideological. But what does this last sentence mean? Well, it means that for Marxism, culture is not simply an agent for artistic expression in its broader sense, but a vehicle for economic dogmas and political values. Similarly, postcolonial theory, which derives from Marxism, provides a framework for the development of cultural imperialism. The critical purpose of postcolonial studies is to account for and to combat the residual effects, be they social, political, or cultural, of colonialism upon the peoples once ruled by the mother country. By mother country, you can think of Britain in relation to India, for example, or France in relation to Algeria. Contemporary postcolonial theory looks at colonialism in a broader sense. In fact, although most countries are now independent of the formal colonialism that once characterized most of the world's societies, even these technically independent countries are caught up in a post-colonial web of cultural imperialism, which means that the Western world has managed to create new forms of dependence for developing countries, a form of dependence that include, for example, the importation of media products from first world media industries. As I mentioned before, while cultural imperialism refers broadly to the Western world, many writers and supporters of the theory have traditionally associated cultural imperialism to American capitalism and American multi billion-dollar industries. It is not a coincidence that the term cultural imperialism has been often substituted by terms that attacked American consumerism more consistently. Such terms include Coca colonization, McDonaldization, and directly in line with the field of media studies, Disneyfication. The last term refers to the work of two leftist writers, Dorfman and Madelard, who, in the 1970s, wrote the now classic book How to Read Donald Duck. While dated, the book explores the way Donald Duck comics justified and promoted American corporate exploitation of Latin American countries. The following slides will cover some of the major figures in the theoretical discussions about cultural imperialism. Among them are Herbert Schiller, Michel Foucault, Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak, and John Tomlinson. We need to go back to the 1970s to discuss Herbert Schiller, the communication scholar that began discussions of cultural imperialism in relation to mass media. Schiller warned of two major trends: the private takeover of public space and public institutions at home, and U.S. corporate domination of cultural life abroad, especially in developing nations, which relates directly to the initial definitions of cultural imperialism that I discussed in the beginning. Schiller was also widely known for the term packaged consciousness, that argues American media is controlled by a few corporations that create, process, refine, and preside over the circulation of images and information which determines our beliefs, attitudes, and ultimately our behavior. As we will see in the next module, this corporate concept of American media is at the core of political economic discussions about communications. A more nuanced and highly theoretical interpretation of cultural imperialism comes from French philosopher Michel Foucault. The work of Foucault has been particularly influential for many academics who utilize the term cultural imperialism in his philosophical interpretation of power. Foucault defines power as immaterial, or as a certain type of relation between individuals that has to do with complex strategic social positions that relate to the subject's ability to control its environment and influence those around itself. Once again, cultural imperialism, in Foucault's view, is about imbalanced power relations where one subject, be it an individual, a government, or a media corporation, has the ability to exert its influence over its surrounding environment. However, Foucault's concept of power received some critiques. One of the most notable ones came from late American Palestinian scholar Edward Said, who criticized Foucault's theory of power, suggesting that, and I'm quoting, Foucault was far more concerned with power than with the factors opposing it. End of quote. A renowned advocate against misrepresentations of Arabs and Islam, Said's work focuses not only on the theoretical mechanism of power, but proposes instead an active agenda to find oppression. Said is a founding figure of postcolonialism established with the book Orientalism, which he published in 1978. Orientalism is a critique of the Western knowledge of the East, specifically the English and the French constructions of what is and what is not Oriental. Said proposes that despite the formal end of the Age of Empire after the Second World War, colonial imperialism left a cultural legacy to the previously colonized peoples, which remains in their contemporary civilizations, and that cultural imperialism is very influential in understanding international systems of power. Similarly to Said, Indian scholar Gayatri Spivak has significantly contributed to the development of postcolonial theory. Spivak argues that Western philosophy has a history of not only exclusion of the lower classes from discourse, whom she refers to as subalterns, but also does not allow them to occupy the space of a fully human subject. In her book, Can the Subaltern Speak?, Spivak criticizes common Western representations of the sati, an ancient Indian practice by which a widow would immolate herself on her husband's pyre. She laments that those representations are controlled by authors other than the participants, specifically English colonizer and Hindu leaders. Because of this, Spivak argues that the subaltern, referring specifically to the communities that participate in the sati, are not able to represent themselves through their own voice. The last author I want to discuss is actually a critic of the original cultural imperialist thesis, John Tomlinson. Tomlinson problematizes the unidirectional interpretations of imperialism as cultural domination from one country to other regions, and introduces the ideas of negotiations between global and local forces. Tomlinson proved that audiences of media accept cultural values in selective manner and are quite resistant to manipulations or invasions of Western, specifically American, cultures than assumed by many critical media theorists. This approach challenges some persistent myths about cultural imperialism and offers an original and persuasive thesis on the significantly moderating effects of local cultural communications. His ideas prove fundamental to allow global media studies to transition from the monolithic concept of media imperialism to the more fluid concept of media globalization. In this respect, I want to discuss two important passages from two of the readings assigned as a companion to this lecture. The readings by David Morley and Jonathan Gray follow Tomlinson's critical approach, and the authors add nuance to the contemporary debate about cultural imperialism in the media. Morley writes, and I'm quoting, "In the traditional debates about cultural and media imperialism, we find some important questions still lurking and still unanswered, which may provide us with the historical perspective we need if we are able to properly grasp the issues facing us today as we discuss globalization. I am to trace some of the roots of contemporary debates about globalization in an older discourse, which spoke of the problems of media imperialism, the free flow of information, the possibilities for a new world information order, and the dangers that used to be described as Americanization." End of quote. Morley's goal, then, is to trace a theoretical trajectory between the old cultural imperialist positions and to reframe those discourses in the contemporary discussions about globalization, in order to propose a less pessimistic view about the flow of information. Gray applies a revised imperialist argument to the analysis of the international reception of The Simpsons. Quote, "In this article, then, I wish to complicate notions of global cultural flows by discussing the case of The Simpsons and its reception by a group of non-American viewers. The show's depiction of America, the American suburb, and American capitalism are a far cry from flag-wavingly chauvinistic. Moreover, adding weight to what textual analysis suggests, audience research into a specific group of non-Americans who watch the program will show that, to some, The Simpsons is read as an at times incisive criticism of America and the American dream." End of quote. What Gray suggests is that while The Simpsons can be discussed as an example of American cultural domination abroad, its very satirical representation of America allows foreign audiences to actually criticize the US instead of blindly accepting its cultural values. Finally, I want to conclude discussing some critiques that have been advanced against the strict thesis of cultural imperialism. Such critiques involve four main areas: media flow, the concept of glocalization, the idea of cultural protectionism, and the audience itself. Let's begin with flow. The original model of cultural imperialism can certainly be criticized for concentrating on instances of one way flow from the USA to the rest of the world, as we mentioned before. In this respect, then, cultural imperialism ignores the importance of the counterflows generated by regional television and national cinema exporters in various other parts of the world. Two examples are the increasing growth of Bollywood cinema internationally and the traditional popularity Latin American telenovelas have enjoyed on American TV. The second critique refers to the idea of globalization, defined as the adaptation of international products around the particularities of a local culture in which they are sold. So, one of the limitations of the original model of cultural imperialism is that it takes no account of the strategies of globalization of their products now frequently adopted by cultural exporters. An example can be found in the different culinary adaptations McDonald's adopts when opening stores in foreign countries. McDonald's India does not sell beef, for example, but offers a chicken Maharajan mac. The problem with cultural protectionism is more nuanced. It is based on the notion that there are pure, aesthetic, cultural, and national spaces challenged by cultural imperialism which must be defended. The problem here is how one is to define what constitutes the original, indigenous, culturally pure forms that are to be defended without falling into an essentialist position. We can use America as an example. If we want to defend the original American values and beliefs, can we all agree on what they are? Can we come up with just one definition of such values and beliefs? Clearly, this matter is much more complex, so when we decide to defend a culture, we always need to be aware of what kind of implicit selection we are making and what kind of culture we are actually defending and what we are instead leaving out. Finally, the strongest critique against cultural imperialism involves the audience itself. A serious problem with the basic thesis of cultural imperialism, as developed by Schiller and others, is that it tends to assume that the media have straightforward, predictable, and automatic effects on their audience. This model of the audience has largely been discredited in recent years, as it has come to be recognized that audiences are active in various ways, as they select from and reinterpret for their own purposes the media materials that they consume, which might be in direct contrast to the original intent of the media producers. In closing, I want to leave you with some questions that we can use to begin our class discussion. First of all, is there a direct correspondence between economic supremacy and cultural domination and imperialism? Second, is such a relation more complex? And finally, are there any possible forms of local or indigenous resistance within global consumption? Together with your questions, these ideas will help us discuss cultural imperialism in class. Include these concepts in your reading report and write questions that can help clarify these complex theoretical concepts. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in class.